There's a moment in cinema when everything you thought you knew about a franchise gets turned upside down, and you realize you will never be able to look at that story the same way again. In Predator, Badlands, that moment doesn't happen in the middle of the film. It happens in the very first seconds. The camera opens on an alien planet you don't recognize. It's not the Guatemalan jungle. It's not Los Angeles. It's not Colorado. It's another world with different light, a different texture, a different smell. You feel it even in the way every shot was composed. And then he appears, a predator, young, smaller than the ones you know, carrying a weight on his back that isn't just physical. And before you realize what's happening, the film has already made one thing clear. You are not here to root against this being. You are here to root for him. This is what makes Predator, Badlands, one of the boldest films released in 2025. Not because it has the best special effects of the year, though it does. Not because it features one of the most surprising performances, though it has that too. But because Dan Trachtenberg, the same director who revitalized the franchise with Prey in 2022, made the most radical decision anyone could make with this intellectual property, putting the monster in the role of the hero. Think about what that means. For almost 40 years, the predator was the adversary. It was the creature that arrived, hunted, killed, and disappeared. It was the danger the human protagonist had to overcome. Arnold Schwarzenegger survived it in 1987. Danny Glover faced it on the streets of Los Angeles. Adrien Brody tried to outrun it in an alien forest. And in 2022, Amber Midthunder defeated it on the American plains of the 18th century, in what was one of the best franchise entries in decades. But always, without fail, the story was told through the eyes of the hunted. Predator, Badlands completely tears up that contract. Here, the story is told through the eyes of the hunter. And not just any hunter. Hunter rejected by his own father, deemed too weak to belong to his own clan, forced to prove his worth on a planet that wants to kill him at every step. In other words, Dan Trachtenberg turned the most iconic action sci-fi monster into an underdog. And it worked. The film premiered on November 7th, 2025. In the United States, opening with $40 million in its first weekend, and breaking the franchise's opening record. In total, it grossed $184 million worldwide. But the numbers, though impressive, tell only half the story. The other half lies in what the audience felt when they sat in their seats and let this film in. Many went to the cinema skeptical. A PG-13 rating for a Predator film. No humans in a single scene. A predator as a sympathetic protagonist. It sounded like a combination that shouldn't work. And yet, the audience score on Rotten Tomatoes was 96%. The cinema score, which measures the immediate audience reaction on opening night, was in Aminus the highest in the entire franchise. The audience that walked in, skeptical, walked out, applauding. I understand the skepticism. The Predator franchise has a complicated history. After the 1987 classic, the second film divided opinions. The crossovers with the Alien franchise were mixed bags. The 2018 reboot with Boyd Holbrook received an icy reception. It was only with Prey in 2022 that the franchise finally breathed again. And Prey was a film that also bit higher predator in the 18th century. An indigenous protagonist, no Hollywood Alisters, released straight to streaming. Everyone thought It was risky. Everyone was wrong. Predator, Badlands, repeats the bet. But it doubles down. There are no humans in this movie. None. The main characters are a young Yortier named Dick and a Weyland-Yutani android named Thea. The villains are other synthetics and other Yortier, and the planet where the story takes place. Jenna is a place Trachtenberg himself describes as a world where even the plants want to kill you. This is the film's bravest choice, and also its most revealing. Because by removing humans from the picture, the director is forced to do something most action films avoid. Build empathy for characters who don't look like us, don't speak our language, and don't share our values. And it is exactly this, empathy, that makes the film work on an emotional level you wouldn't expect from a franchise that was born with Schwarzenegger. Carrying a machine gun in a tropical rainforest, Demetrius Sust, a New Zealand actor, an acrobat whom most people probably had never heard of before, plays Dick inside a suit weighing 15 kilos, speaking an alien language created from scratch by a specialized linguist, and delivers a fully convincing performance. You see fear in his eyes. You see pain. You see the exact moment a warrior rehearses becoming a leader. All this from behind a mask, claws, and mandibles. It is a physical and emotional feat on a level that deserves more recognition than it will probably get. And then there is Elle Fanning. If Demetrius Shostakovich is the soul of the film, Elle Fanning is its voice, its heart, its moral compass. She plays two characters, Tia and Tessa, who are practically opposites in every way. And she does it with a precision that only someone with her technical mastery and emotional sensitivity could deliver. Thea is warm, curious, sometimes naive in a way that makes you smile. Tessa is cold, calculating, driven by a logic that leaves no room for compassion. The same actress, the same face, and you never confuse the two. For this performance, Elle Fanning won the Saturn Award for Best Actress in February 2026. It came as no surprise to anyone who saw the film. What is important to state right up front, before diving into the details, the production, the directorial choices, and the specific moments that make this film so special, is this: Predator, Badlands, is a film that cares about story. It is not an empty spectacle of special effects built on brand nostalgia. Every visual choice, every design detail, every nuance of the central performance serves a narrative that treats its non-human characters with the same seriousness and depth as the best sci-fi films treat theirs. Think of Avatar and The Way. Cameron built the world of the Na'vi. Think of Guardians of the Galaxy and the way James Gunn turned a raccoon and a tree into emotional icons. Predator, Badlands, belongs in that conversation. And at the same time, it's an action movie. Real, physical, brutal action within the limits of a PG-13 rating, with combat sequences that carry weight and consequence. The power loader fight scene, the final confrontation on the Yortier home planet. The first time Dick faces the Kalisk alone, these are scenes you will remember. But let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about how this film was born, who these characters are, what happens on Jenna, and why this might be the most important entry in the Predator franchise since the 1987 original. Because there is a lot to say about Predator, Badlands, and every layer you peel back makes the film more interesting. The question Don Trachtenberg asked himself before writing this story was simple but radical. After Prey, which explored the predator through the eyes of the prey, what would be the next frontier for this franchise? The answer came in one sentence. What if we told the story through the eyes of the predator itself? What if, instead of rooting for the human who wants to survive, we rooted for the yachter who wants to prove he belongs? That question changed everything. When Prey hit Hulu in August 2022, with no massive stars, no theatrical release, and none of the typical blockbuster, fan for almost everyone expected the worst. It was the sixth film in the Predator franchise. The series had stumbled so many times that the skepticism was, in a way, rational. And then the film dropped, and suddenly people were talking about Predator in a way they hadn't since 1987. Prey was a resounding success. Critics, audiences, billions of streams on Hulu. It was a genuine rebirth of a property that felt exhausted. For Dan Trachtenberg, that success opened a door. But what lay on the other side of that door was a choice. 20th Century Studios, now part of Disney, came to him with the obvious question, when are you making the next one? And Trachtenberg could have given the obvious answer, a sequel to Prey, back in the Americas, with Amber Midthunder. It would be safe. It would probably work. It would be a guaranteed hit. But Trachtenberg didn't want to do the obvious. He said in an interview that he didn't want to just make a sequel to the cool thing. He wanted something that hadn't been seen yet. So he went to 20th Century Studios with two ideas at once. The first was Predator, Badlands, a live-action film, starring a yachter protagonist on an alien planet. The second would become Predator, Killer of Killers, an animated series that expanded the franchise universe in completely different directions. Trachtenberg wasn't asking to make a movie. He was asking to build a universe. And Disney said yes to both ideas. This is the part of the story that reveals a lot about the current state of franchise filmmaking, because, honestly, there is a massive difference between a studio that says make a sequel and a studio that asks, what is the story you really want to tell? Disney bet on Trachtenberg in the most generous way possible, giving him the creative freedom that very few directors in the studio system get. And he used that freedom to make the riskiest decision he could. The core idea for Predator, Badlands, was born from a very simple question Trachtenberg asked himself. What happens if you put a yachter through the exact same gauntlet that Dutch went through in the original film? What happens when you strip away all of the hunter's advantages, isolate him in a hostile environment, and force him to prove his worth? In the previous films, the Predator arrived, equipped, prepared, in control. He was the Predator in the most literal sense. But Trachtenberg wanted to subvert that. He wanted to show what happens when the most feared hunter in the galaxy becomes the underdog of the story. And there was something else. Trachtenberg always viewed the original 1987 Predator as a genre-defying film. In a conversation with the Walt Disney Company, he described his experience watching the classic for the first time as something he never forgot. That was the first time I had seen a movie like that, one that started as a military action movie, then turned into a horror movie, then a slasher, then sci-fi. This ability of the Predator concept to shift genres, to reinvent itself from within, is what made the franchise so rich for new storytelling. With Badlands, he wanted to embrace that potential to the fullest. The screenplay was written by Patrick Eisen, based on a story developed by Eisen and Trachtenberg together. Eisen was already known for the TV series Treadstone and his work on Preso, it was a partnership with a proven track record. What they built together was a script that, at its core, is a coming-of-age story. A story about a young warrior who must decide what kind of leader he wants to be, and what kind of world he wants to create. The decision to set the film in the future, the furthest chronologically of any film in the franchise, thus far was liberating for Trachtenberg. In his two previous projects within the Predator universe, he was always working in the past, meaning every gadget, weapon, and piece of technology had to look more primitive than what we had seen in earlier films. In Badlands, for the first time, he could let his imagination run forward. He could show Yartier technology at its most advanced stage without worrying about retroactive continuity, and he took full advantage of it. The planet. Genoa, almost all the film's action takes place, is a visual and narrative creation that took months of design work. Trachtenberg was explicit about his intention. He wanted a place that justified the name Death Planet. Not just a pretty planet with occasional dangers. A planet where the flora itself, every leaf, every root, every vine was structured to kill. An ecosystem built on violence at every level of the food chain. He wanted the audience to feel, in every outdoor scene on Jenna, that simply being there was an act of survival. To film this world, the production chose New Zealand. A choice that, for anyone familiar with the country's cinema, makes perfect sense. New Zealand has landscapes that don't exist anywhere else on Earth. A combination of ancient forests, volcanic terrain, naturally steaming geothermal fields, and an ambient light that, at certain times of day, feels like it belongs on another world. The Rotorua region, listed in the IMDb location credits, has this unique atmospheric quality that the camera captures in a way no soundstage could ever replicate. Filming began on August 27, 2024, under the working title Backpackin', intentionally. Discreet choice, the kind of code name used to keep onlookers and the press away from the set while the serious work is being done. Production spanned 57 days in remote New Zealand locations, with a crew that had to haul heavy equipment over difficult terrain to capture the images Trachtenberg and cinematographer Jeff Cutter envisioned. Cutter also shot Pret. It was a solidified partnership with a shared visual language DAO. A detail most people don't know: Jim Thomas and John Thomas, the brothers who created the original Predator in 1987 and wrote its script, were involved in Badlands as executive producers. This is not a minor detail. It means the film had the blessing of the original mythology's creators, who were at the table during development and who, in some way, recognized in this radical story an honest continuation of what they created nearly 4 decades ago. The production companies involved were 20th Century Studios, Toberoff Productions, and TSG Entertainment, the same structure that had worked for Prey. Distribution was handled by 20th Century Studios itself. With a theatrical release on November 6, 2025, one thing that sets Predator, Badlands apart from Tana. Almost every franchise film released in recent years is the clarity of its vision right from the start. It wasn't a movie born from a corporate need to extend a brand. It was a movie born from a director who had a genuine question, a genuine story to tell, and the courage to go to the studio and say, "I want to do something that has never been done in this franchise." There is a quote from Trachtenberg that sums up this mindset perfectly. He said that when he pitched the idea internally, he was blindly excited. He believed so much in the concept that the emotion preceded the doubt. But as filming progressed and the reality of what they were building started to weigh on him, a movie with no human characters, starring a protagonist in a 15-kilo suit speaking a fabricated alien language, the doubts crept in. "I started to get worried," he said. "We could be making a massive mistake." They weren't, but the path between the bold idea and the final product that the public embraced with a 96% approval rating was not a straight line. It was a process of meticulous construction of world, of characters, of language, of creatures, of relationships that began long before shooting and continued right into the editing room. And every choice along that path was made with one central question in mind: what makes this predator human? That is the question no film in the franchise had ever asked before. And the answer Badlands found becomes clearer as you understand who Dick is, why he was exiled, and what he wants to prove. Before you understand Dick, you need to understand the world that created him. And before you understand that world, you need to forget everything you already know about the Yortia from previous films. Because Predator, Badlands, expands the mythology of this race in a way no franchise entry had attempted until now. In the classic films, the Yortia were deliberately presented as enigmatic. You saw enough to understand they were hunters, that they had a culture based on honor and the ritual of the hunt, and that they chose their prey based on threat levels and combat ability. But the interior of their society, the hierarchy, family relations, internal disputes, what it means to be accepted or rejected by the clan, had never been explored in depth on screen. It was a backdrop, not a story. Badlands makes that backdrop the center of the story. The Yortia in this film are no longer just monsters with advanced tech. They are a civilization. A violent civilization organized around hierarchies of hunting and combat, where a warrior's worth is measured by their feats, the respect of their peers, and the approval of the clan leader. Their culture is brutal, yet deeply coherented, has an internal logic that, once you begin to understand it, makes the characters' choices completely comprehensible, even if they are choices no human being would make. And at the center of this culture is the concept of honor. For the Yortia, honor isn't an abstract virtue. It is currency. It is what determines your place in the clan, the respect you command, and the lineage you carry. Losing your honor isn't just a personal failure, it is social erasure. And that is exactly what happens to Dick. The film introduces Dick, still young by Yortia standards, in a hunting ritual that should have been his proving ground. The specific situation that leads to his exile is left deliberately ambiguous by the script, in some respects because part of what makes the character interesting is that you, as the viewer, have to fill in the blanks with your own interpretations. What is clear is this: Dick made a decision that was interpreted by his father, Nisha, the clan leader, as weakness. A choice that, by the rigid standards of Yortia culture, was unacceptable. And Ninja, instead of killing his son or simply demoting him, does something perhaps worse. He exiles him. He sends him to Jenna. Jenna is the punishment. The planet's name is built up throughout the film as a legend, almost like a myth. The older warriors of the clan speak of Jenna in a tone of warning. It's not a place you go to voluntarily. It is a place you are sent when the clan wants you to disappear without having to take direct responsibility for your death. It is the Yortia equivalent of being banished to the end of the world with zero resources and zero allies. And when the camera finally arrives on Jenna, you understand why New Zealand, as mentioned earlier, provides the physical foundation for this world. But the production design and visual effects worked by WTFX, the same company behind Avatar, The Lord of the Rings, and dozens of other sci-fi cinematic milestones, transformed those real locations into a planet that feels genuinely alien. The vegetation was altered in post-production with hues that don't exist in Earth's normal palette. The creatures that inhabit Jenna, from the smallest to the story's central threat, were designed with their own evolutionary logic. And Trachtenberg made it clear. He wanted Jenna to be felt, not just seen. He wanted every outdoor scene to carry a background tension, that feeling that the environment itself was hostile, that stopping for more than a few seconds in the wrong spot could be fatal, not because of some specific enemy, but because the entire planet functioned as a sophisticated trap. But the most specific danger of Jenna, the threat that organizes the film's action narrative, is the Kalisk. The Kalisk is a new creature within the Predator universe. It doesn't exist in previous films. It's not a direct reference to the comics or book series. It's an original invention by Trachtenberg and Eisen for this film. And it was conceived from the start as the antithesis of the Predator. If the Yortia are the apex of the food chain on virtually any planet they visit, the Kalisk is the only documented being capable of threatening that supremacy. The description the characters use for the Kalisk in the film is something like the Hunter of Hunters, a creature with predatory intelligence comparable to the Yortia, but physically superior in almost every measure, bigger, stronger, with sharper senses and an almost absurd level of durability. The Kalisk doesn't hunt for ritual or honor codes. It hunts out of pure biological necessity, and Jenna is its territory. What the script does intelligently with the Kalisk is introduce it in stages. First, as a verbal reference, you'll hear about it before you see it, which builds the weight of the threat before it ever appears on screen. Then, in visual fragments, shadow here, a footprint there, the wreckage of something clearly destroyed by an immense force. And finally, in its full form, in a moment the film uses to completely subvert your expectations about what this creature means to the story. Because, and this is one of the script's most elegant moves, the adult Kalisk is not the villain of the film. The revelation that the small creature Dick and Tyre find and begin to call Bud is actually a Kalisk pup, and that the furious, destructive adult Kalisk appearing in the intense third act scenes isn't trying to kill the protagonists. It is looking for its child is one of the best emotional twists of any 2025 blockbuster, because it turns what seemed like a monster into a mother, and it turns the most terrifying creature in the film into a character with a comprehensible motivation. But before getting there, Jenna must be experienced in all its cruelty. And it is in this context the planet that exiles, the culture that condemns, the creature that terrifies that Dick arrives, alone, without his elite weapons, without clan support, with only the bare minimum that a novice Yortia warrior would carry. The design decision to show Dick younger, smaller, and less equipped than the Predator's audiences know from previous films was intentional and essential. Demetrius Shostakovich has an athletic and agile physique that the stunt directors maximized. But within the franchise's visual hierarchy, Dick is clearly not the imposing Predator of the 1987 original. He is faster, more stripped down, more vulnerable. And that is precisely what makes his every victory emotionally satisfying. There is something, Trachtenberg said about Dick's visual design, that captures this intent perfectly. He wanted the character to transmit that vibe of a young guy who wants to prove he's good. A warrior who isn't quite there yet, who still has the maturity and weight of a leader to develop, but who carries a spark inside him that the audience recognizes instantly, because everyone has, at some point in their lives, been in the position of needing to prove something to someone who doubted them. That is what connects Dick to human viewers in a way previous Predators never could. It's not sympathy for the monster. It's identification with the underdog and the universe around Dick the Yautier, culture of honor and exile. The hostile planet of Jenna, the Kalisk threat as an inverted mirror, was built with the care of someone. Who knows, a protagonist only works if the world they exist in feels real. Not decorative, real, with rules, with consequences, with a logic the audience can follow, and that, once established, is never betrayed. Because when the world is real, the stakes are real. And when the stakes are real, you care. There is a scene, early in Predator, Badlands, before any battle, before any alliance, when Dick is still alone on Jenna and still calibrating the magnitude of the mistake he made. He finds the remains of another Yatta, someone who came before him, sent to the same planet for the same reason, and who didn't survive. And the camera lingers on Dick. There is no dramatic music. There is no exaggerated reaction. Just a look. Behind the mandibles and the mask, conveying absolute silence. I know I could be next. There is not a single word of dialogue in that scene that a human can understand. The Yautier language built from scratch by a linguist for this film, complete. With grammar, phonology, and intonation patterns, sounds alien enough to be credible and expressive enough to be emotionally legible. But even without understanding a syllable, you know exactly what Dick is feeling. That is acting. True acting. And the person responsible for it is Demetrius Schuster Koloamatangi. It is impossible to talk about Predator, Badlands, without pausing. To pay real attention to what this actor achieved in this film. Because what he did is extraordinary, and at the same time, it is the kind of work the Hollywood awards system frequently ignores. Physical, bodily work, mediated by a costume. In a non-human role. Andy Serkis built an entire career breaking that prejudice, and still rarely received recognition from the Academy. Schuster Koloamatangi's work in Badlands belongs in that exact same conversation. Demetrius is a New Zealander of Tongan heritage, and came to the project with a background mixing acrobatics, physical performance, and martial arts. The choice was deliberate from the start. Trachtenberg knew he needed someone who could carry 15 kilos of costume for 12 to 14 hours a day on uneven terrain, but who also had the emotional sensitivity of a dramatic actor, because the story demanded the audience fall in love with that character. Finding both things together in a single body is not easy. The training for the role was described as something akin to preparing for an extreme athletic competition show. The comparison to American Ninja Warrior was used by crew members during production interviews, not as hyperbole, but as a literal description of what the role required. Climbing structures, running on uneven surfaces, maintaining precise bodily control while wearing heavy armor, and doing it all while sustaining the physical expressiveness the character demanded. Dick's face is permanently covered. Every emotion has to come from the body, from the tilt of the head, the slump of the shoulders, the way the arms position themselves before a fight, or the way the legs stop completely when he senses danger. There is a specific moment that many critics and viewers mentioned when discussing the film. The first time Dick hears Thea laugh. It is a sound he has clearly never heard before, at least never associated with a non-threatening presence. And Dick's reaction in that instant, captured in a tight shot, is one of pure confusion, slowly morphing into something resembling disarmed curiosity. It's a small moment. It lasts maybe 10 seconds, and it is one of the most humanizing moments a Predator character has ever had on screen. No dialogue, no subtitles, just Demetrios's body speaking. But Dick's character isn't just a performance. It is a careful narrative construction that Patrick Azen's script sustains through every act. What we know about Dick, piecing the story together from the non-linear fragments the film delivers, is this. He grew up in the shadow of Naga, a clan leader with an impeccable reputation and absolutely inflexible expectations. Jar isn't painted as a cartoonish villain. He is a complex figure, a father who loves his son within the narrow limits his culture allows him to demonstrate that love, but who simply cannot accept that his son's path is different from his own. The tension between them is the kind of tension that doesn't need villainy to be painful. It is far too familiar. The decision leading to Dick's exile is presented in a way that maintains intentional ambiguity. What becomes clear is that Dick, during a hunt, chose not to kill when his culture demanded he kill. Not out of cowardice, the film is careful to make that clear, but due to a different assessment of the situation, a reading of honor that didn't align with the clans. And for Enger, a leader whose authority rests exactly on the uniformity of the code among his warriors. That different reading is unacceptable. The exile, therefore, isn't just a punishment. It's a statement. Inger is telling his son, the way you see the world has no place here. And Dick's arc throughout the film is the response to that statement. Not a response born of rebellion, at least, not primarily. It's a response born of self-discovery. Dick goes to Jenna as someone defined by his father's rejection, and he leaves Jenna as someone who has defined himself on his own terms. The difference between those two states is the entire story. What makes this arc so effective is the scale of the changes Dick experiences throughout the film. Every challenge Jenna presents, every choice he makes in Tia's presence, every moment he could act with the cruelty his culture demands, but chooses not to. Each of these moments adds a layer to the character, and Schuster Kolomatongi carries each of these layers with a physicality that makes the character's growth palpable. There is a parallel that the script builds quite subtly between Dick and Bud, the small creature they find and care for, which eventually reveals itself to be a Kalisk pup. Bud is also out of place. Bud is also too young, too small, too vulnerable for the environment he is in. Bud also needs protection. And Dick, who is rejected by his own father, spontaneously chooses to become Bud's protector. Not because he was ordered to, not because he gets something in return, but because he recognizes in that small, displaced being something he recognizes in himself. That choice, more than any fight or victory, is what defines Dick as a character. And it defines the central theme of the film. Family isn't the group that raises you. It is the group you choose. Trachtenberg spoke multiple times about the importance of creating a predator that the audience could care for in the same way they cared for human characters. He said the key was always finding the humanity, not in a literal sense, but in the sense of finding those points of emotional connection that exist regardless of species, appearance, or language. What makes a character human, he said in an interview, is having something to lose and something to prove. Dick has both. He has the honor he lost. He has the place in the clan he wants to win back, or perhaps discover he no longer wants to win back, that the place he wants is not the one his father chose for him. And he has, in the end, a new family that he built with his own hands, on a planet that tried to kill him at every step. It is a simple story in the deepest sense of the word. Simple not as a synonym for easy or shallow, but simple as a synonym for true. A story about belonging, about rejection and rebuilding, about what it means to be strong on terms other than the ones you were taught. The fact that this story is told through an alien Yortia on a fictional planet doesn't make it any less universal. It makes it more interesting, and Demetria Shostakovich, in his debut as a blockbuster protagonist, carried this story with a presence that would be impressive in any context, and is even more impressive given the specific context he worked in. 15 kilos of costume, a language he had to learn from scratch, brutal physical terrain, and at the center of it all, a performance that makes you care about a being that, in previous films, was exclusively the enemy to be defeated. That is no small feat. That is massive. When 20th Century Studios announced that Elle Fanning was cast in Predator, Badlands, the most common reaction was surprise, followed by curiosity. Fanning, known for delicate and emotionally intense roles in films like Real Life, Sleeping Beauty adaptations, or acclaimed series like The Great in an alien sci-fi action franchise. The combination seemed odd at first, and then you watch the movie and you realize there was no more perfect choice. There was no one else who could do what she did in this role, in these roles. Because Fanning doesn't play one character in Badlands. She plays two, Thaya and Tessa, are synthetic Swayland-Yutani, androids, and they are physically identical. The same face, the same voice, the same body, but they are characters that exist in completely opposite emotional dimensions. Thaya is the Sahaya, is the android Dick finds on Jenna, abandoned in a research facility that Wayland-Yutani left behind at an unspecified point before the story begins. She is missing her legs, a condition that exists not out of damage, but by design, because she was built specifically for lab work and didn't require independent locomotion for her designated functions. She moves around on an improvised floating platform that the design team created for the character. And this physical limitation, rather than diminishing her presence, amplifies her fragility and, simultaneously, her resilience. Because Thaya is, in many ways, the bravest character in the film, she has no weapons. She has no combat training. She is alone on a hostile planet, in a body that wasn't designed for physical survival. And yet she faces every situation with an emotional openness that defies what you would expect from artificial intelligence. Thaya feels genuine curiosity. She feels joy. She feels fear. And she feels connection, a real connection with Dick that grows organically and convincingly throughout the film. The question of synthetic consciousness in Predator. Badlands is not treated with the heavy-handed philosophy that some sci-fi works adopt when tackling the theme of androids with feelings. The film doesn't stop to give speeches about what it means to be human or what the soul is. Instead, it just lets Thaya be. It lets her exist with all her curiosity and warmth and physical limitations, trusting that the viewer will reach the right conclusions without being handheld. That trust is one of the signs of Trachtenberg's narrative maturity, and Elle Fanning infuses Thaya with a physical and emotional warmth that goes far beyond what the text suggests. There is a quality to Fanning something in the rhythm of her speech, the way she uses silence, the openness of her face that conveys presence without ever feeling calculated. Thaya feels real, not because the script insists she's real, but because Fanning makes you feel that she is. The physical performance is particularly notable. Filming scenes where your character has no legs requires a specific bodily discipline. You must keep your lower limbs out of the shot in ways that don't look artificial, while maintaining the expressive mobility of your torso, arms, and face. Fanning spent weeks training for this before shooting began, and the result on screen is a fluidity that makes the character's limitation feel completely natural. But then there is Tessa. If Thaya is warmth, Tessa is cold. If Thaya is openness, Tessa is calculation. If Thaya looks at Dick and sees the possibility of connection, Tessa looks at any being and sees only utility. Tessa is the version of Thaya that Weyland-Yutani idealized from the beginning, without the inconvenient curiosity, without the unnecessary empathy, without the emotional deviations that make Thaya corporately unpredictable. Tessa is what a corporation would build if it could design. Intelligence without conscience, and she is terrifying precisely because she wears Tia's face. The decision to make Tessa and Tia physically identical isn't just a production trick to save on acquisites, a deliberate, thematic choice. Tessa's horror comes from the contrast with what you've already learned to love in Thaya. Every time Tessa acts with cruelty, your mind involuntarily superimposes the image of Thaya onto that same face, and the emotional effect is disturbing in a way no conventionally designed villain could achieve. Fanning spoke in interviews about the approach she used to distinguish the two characters beyond the obvious. For her, the key lay in the quality of their attention. Thaya pays attention to the world with one daring new thing as a discovery. Thaya pays attention with cold analysis. Thaya new thing is data. They are the same hardware unit, she said. Paraphrasing, but the software is completely different, and the software dictates everything. This distinction, simple in concept but extraordinarily difficult to execute, is what sustains the emotional impact of the scenes where the two versions, or the character, appear in mirroring contexts. The film uses this mirroring elegantly. There are moments where an action by Tessa directly echoes a previous action by Thaya, and the comparison between the two needs no words to be devastating. The connection to Weyland-Yutani is another element. That Predator, Badlands handles with care. The corporation is part of the mythology of both the Alien and Predator franchises, appearing in the 2004 and 2007 Alien vs. Predator crossovers, but never integrated so centrally into the narrative of a solo film. In Badlands, Weyland-Yutani isn't just a fan service reference. It is an active force in the story, with agents on the planet, specific objectives regarding the Kalisk, and a presence that complicates Dick and Tia's situation in ways the third act exploits with escalating intensity, and Tessa is the armed extension of that corporate presence. She didn't arrive on Jenna by accident. She arrived with a mission, with resources, and with an absolute lack of scruples that makes her the most effective antagonist the Predator franchise has ever had, not because she is more physically threatening than a Kalisk or a Yatia warrior, but because she acts with intelligence, foresight, and a void of empathy that is, ultimately, colder and more ruthless than any brute force. The SAT Award for Best Actress that Elle Fanning received in February 2026 was well deserved. But what is most revealing about the range of her performance is that, in audience discussions about the film on social media, forums, and viewer reviews, both characters are treated with affection and horror proportional to their functions. In the story, people love Thea, people fear Tessa, and both reactions are entirely convincing because the same actress built both with the same mastery and dedication. There is a scene near the end of the second act, which will be detailed later when covering that part of the story where Thea and Tessa meet for the first time from the viewer's perspective, and the camera simply sits between them, alternating glances. It is a scene with no physical action, no special effects. Just Elle Fanning looking at Elle Fanning, each version of the character occupying the space with a completely distinct presence. It is theater inside an alien sci-fi blockbuster, and it works perfectly. What Predator, Badlands understood, that many films of the same caliber do not, is that the most sophisticated special effects and the most elaborate action sequences only work if you care about the people, or in this case, the beings on screen. Dick and Thea needed to be real. They needed to be present in a way that transcended the fantastical elements around them. And Demetrius Schuster, Kola Matangi, and Elle Fanning, coming from completely different performance universes, found a chemistry together that carries the entire film. That chemistry begins in the very first meeting between the two characters. And that is where the story truly starts moving. The beginning of Predator, Badlands, doesn't start with an explosion. It doesn't start with a chase or a firefight. It starts with a ceremony. The ritual of exile in the films and Yortia mythology has always been touched on tangentially, a reference here, a fragment there. In Badlands, Trachtenberg places the viewer right inside that ritual from the first minutes, and the effect is immediate. You are in an environment that is clearly not Earth. You are surrounded by beings speaking a language you don't understand. And in the center of it all is Dick, on his knees, in a posture that communicates defeat even before you understand the details of what happened. The exile scene is shot with a visual restraint that contrasts with what you expect from a blockbuster. Opening. The camera stays tight. The space feels cramped. The lighting is warm but harsh, the kind of light that hides nothing. And Enjar, Dick's father, is presented from behind first, a significant choice. You feel his authority before you see his face. When his face finally appears, there is no anger in it. There is something worse. There is disappointment that has already dried up, that has moved past the emotional phase and arrived at an administrative coldness. Enjar is no longer suffering over his son's choice. He has already made his decision. The exile was decided before the scene even began. This dynamic punishment as an accomplished fact, not as a discussion, immediately establishes the kind of culture Dick inhabits. It's not a world of negotiation. It's a world of code. And Dick violated the code. The journey to Jenna is brief on screen, but production took care to make it physically real. The ship transporting Dick to the planet was designed within the yacht aesthetic established by previous films, but with a more functional, less ceremonial riad, the type of transport used when the destination isn't a prestige jaunt, but a banishment. Dick is loaded onto it like cargo. No farewell ceremony. No parting words from Genjar. The indifference of the boarding process is itself a form of cruelty. And then comes Jenna. The first image of the planet is wider landscape that Jeff Cutter's camera captures in natural light, possessing that specific New Zealand quality that mixes beauty and unease in a way you feel in the back of your neck before you consciously process it. The vegetation is lush, but strange oversaturated, organized in a way that feels less like a forest and more like a snare. The ambient sound that the sound designer created for Jenna deserves its own mention. It is a constant layer of organic noise that is never completely identifiable, never lets the ear relax, creating a background tension that remains even in the calmest scenes. Dick drops onto Jenna with minimal gear. A basic spear, a mask with thermal and biomimetic vision capabilities, but without the advanced weapon systems the Predators from earlier films used as standard. No shoulder-mounted plasma caster, no dual retractable wrist blades that fans of the franchise adore. The production choice to strip Dick technologically was essential for his character archive. He had all the gear. The planet wouldn't be a real threat, and the story of overcoming the odds would hold no weight. Dick's first few minutes on Jenna are spent in cautious reconnaissance. Trachtenberg shoots this sequence almost like a pure survival film. Dick, observing, calculating, registering every detail of the environment with the efficiency of a trained predator who is still reading unknown territory. There is an elegance to this sequence born from the silence. No music, no voiceover, just the character and the environment in a silent conversation of mutual evaluation. It is during this reconnaissance phase that Dick finds the remains of the previous Yotooth, the scene mentioned in the chapter on Demetrius's performance. That 10-second moment that says everything without saying anything. And it is right after this moment, as Dick is internally recalibrating what the planet represents, that he first detects Tia's presence. The first encounter between Dick and Nair. Tia's handled with a sense of comedic timing that catches you completely off guard, not because the film promised comedy, but because the situation is genuinely absurd in a very human way. Thaya is stuck. Not stuck in the sense of being captured by someone, stuck in the sense that the improvised floating structure she uses to move got tangled in a specific patch of Jenna's vegetation, and she's been trying to free herself long enough that she's clearly moved past rational solutions into loud, technical cursing. Dick watches her for a moment that lasts a second too long. The exact amount of time it takes for observation to turn into curiosity and then backs away. He is not there to help random androids. He is there to survive. But Thaya saw him. And Thaya, unlike what Dick would expect from any being on a hostile planet, doesn't react with fear. She reacts with genuine interest. She asks a question out loud in a language Dick clearly doesn't understand, but with an unmistakable, universal tone of, "Can you give me a hand here?" This scene has been repeatedly described by critics and viewers as the moment the film completely wins you over, because what happens next isn't heroism. Dick doesn't solve Tia's problem with a grand gesture. He solves it with practically adolescent impatience, with a distinct vibe of "I'm going to do this quickly, so you stop making noise and I can get back to my own problems. And Thaya thanks him with an enthusiasm that is equally disproportionate to the situation, causing Dick to recoil as if she were a threat. It's funny, it's genuinely funny, and that matters immensely, because a movie that can make you laugh with its characters before making you suffer for them has built something rare: trust. You laugh with Dick and Thaya in this first scene, and that creates an emotional investment that the upcoming acts of danger and tension can mine in ways that would be impossible. Without that foundation, the production filmed the initial encounter between the two characters over 2 days, on location a specific forest area near Rotorua that the production design team modified with additional vegetation created by WTFX to amplify the environment's alien weirdness. Demetrius Schuster-Kolamatangi and Elle Fanning spent significant time before filming exploring the characters' dynamic offset, developing the rhythm of their relationship during a rehearsal phase that Trachtenberg considered essential precisely because their chemistry needed to feel established, not manufactured. What is noticeable in the final result is that Dick and Thaya have an interaction rhythm that feels like it has history, even though they are meeting for the first time. There is a balance between Dick's suspicion and Tia's openness that finds its equilibrium very quickly, but pickly not because the script forces the friendship, but because the two actors organically found the right tempo for these two specific beings. As the first act progresses, the alliance between Dick and Thaya forms out of necessity before it becomes a choice. Jenna is inhospitable enough to make cooperation a matter of survival, and the skills of the two complement each other in a way the script establishes with clear logic. Dick has physical prowess, combat training, and an instinctual knowledge of hunting. Thaya has access to planetary data, technological analysis capabilities, and a memory that registers everything she sees with absolute precision. What neither of them has, initially, is trust in the other. And building that trust, scene by scene, choice by choice, is the emotional core of the first act and, in many ways, of the entire film. When Bud appears for the first time small, confused, clearly scared, manifestly out of place on a planet that should be its home, their reactions are telling. Dick evaluates the creature as a potential threat. Thaya evaluates it as a being in need of care, and Thaya acts first. This divide in instinct between the two characters is reconfigured throughout the film as Dick learns that not everything small and vulnerable is harmless, and not everything that seems harmless is what it appears. But for now, in the first act, Bud is just a strange creature the three of them don't understand yet. And the three, without anyone making it formal, begin to walk together. Bud is, objectively speaking, one of the strangest creatures recent sci-fi design has produced. It is not cute in the conventional way Hollywood uses to generate immediate attachment. It's not fluffy like a baby pet. It doesn't have big, expressive eyes explicitly designed to tug at your heartstrings. It is weird. It has textures that make no immediate sense, movements that alternate between graceful and clumsy in a way that suggests a being that hasn't fully learned its own body yet. And it is exactly this weirdness that makes the attachment to it genuine rather than manipulative. WTFX built Bud as a mix of practical and digital elements, varying from scene to scene depending on the required degree of physical interaction. In wide shots, it is entirely digital. In close contact scenes when Thaya holds it, when Dick examines it, when the three rest together in a rare moment of truce, there was an articulated, physical version that allowed the actors to react to a real presence in the space. This combination, executed with a level of detail WTFX applies to everything they do. Results in a creature that feels like it has physical consistency even when it isn't really there. But Bud isn't just a well-executed special effect. He is a character. And the second act of Predator, Badlands uses Bud in a narratively sophisticated way that only fully reveals itself when the creature's true nature comes to light. For much of the second act, Bud acts as the emotional glue between Dick and Tyre. He gives them a shared responsibility, a third party that needs them, creating situations where the two must make decisions together, negotiate opposing viewpoints, and find common ground. Dick tends to want to protect Bud through distance, keeping the creature safe by keeping it far from danger. Tyre tends to want to protect Bud through proximatizing close enough to intervene when necessary. This difference in approach creates minor conflicts that serve as the domestic, almost comical version of the larger tensions. The third act will escalate. The second act is where the film finds its signature rhythm, that unusual mix of genuine tension, moments of levity that arrive when you least expect them, and character development that advances naturally rather than mechanically. There is a sequence in the middle of the second act that perfectly encapsulates this quality. Dick, Tyre, and Bud need to cross an area of Jenna that is particularly dense with minor predators, creatures that individually pose a little threat to a Yotia, but in a group are dangerous enough to command respect. The sequence starts as pure tension, low camera, muted sound. The three moving with utmost current ends with Bud doing something completely unexpected, and idiosyncratically Bud, breaking the tension in a way that provokes an involuntary laugh. It is not a scripted joke. It is a situation that emerges from the character of the creature, and that is much harder to pull off. It is also in the second act that the clues about Bud's nature begin to appear, subtle enough not to telegraph the reveal, yet present enough that in hindsight you see them clearly. The rate of Bud's growth, which is faster than it should be for any creature of comparable size. The way certain Jenna predators that initially approach the trio back away when they get close to Bud, not Dick, which would be the obvious assumption, but Bud specifically. And a design detail that the cinematographer deliberately frames in two separate shots. The physical markings on Bud's body that mirror, in miniature, the markings visible on the adult Kalisk when it first appears in the distance. If you are paying attention, the elements are all there. Most people aren't paying attention to the right details because the film masterfully misdirected them. And when the reveal hits, it works on two levels simultaneously: intellectual surprise and emotional recognition. You are surprised because you didn't consciously connect the dots. At the same time, you feel like you already knew, like the story had always been pointing right there. That is the structure of a good plot twist, not the kind that tricks you by breaking its own rules, but the kind that tricks you by being more honest than you realized. But before the Bud reveal comes Tessa. Tessa first appears on screen with the absolute composure of someone operating in a corporate boardroom, which is specifically disturbing given that the boardroom is a planet actively trying to kill everyone on it. She leads a group of Weyland-Yutani androids who have arrived on Jenna with equipment, defined objectives, and a total disregard for the other lives present on the planet, whether they be Yotia, synthetic, or native creatures. Tessa's objective on Jenna is the Kalisk, but not to destroy it, to capture it. Weyland-Yutani has a history. Within the shared sci-fi universe of the Alien and Predator franchises, of viewing extraordinary biological creatures as corporate assets rather than living beings. It's the same corporation that, in Alien, sent the crew of the Nostromo to retrieve a xenomorph, instructing the android Ash to ensure the creature returned to Earth, even if the crew was expendable. In Badlands, this corporate philosophy is embodied by Tessa with a clarity that makes her instantly legible as an antagonist, not because she is melodramatically evil, but because her logic is internally consistent and utterly devoid of compassion. What makes Tessa especially effective as a villain is that she's not wrong on the facts. She is wrong on the values. Her assessment of the situation on Jenna is frequently precise. Her plans are functionally sound. She understands what Bud is before any other character verbally articulates it, and she uses that understanding with an efficiency that is admirably competent and morally bankrupt all at once. The first direct interaction between Tessa and Dick is one of the highest tension moments in the second act. It's not an immediate physical confrontation. Tessa is too smart for that. It's a negotiation, conducted with the handicap that the two share no common language and must use Thea as an involuntary intermediary. Tessa wants Bud. Dick will not hand over Bud. And Tessa, having fully read the situation, realizes the most efficient way to break the stalemate isn't confronting Dick directly, it's separating Dick from Thea. Because Thea is the vulnerability. This strategic read from Tessa, this ability to identify emotional attachment as the most effective lever of pressure, elevates the character beyond a functional villain. In a sense, she understands the other characters better than they understand themselves. The difference is that she uses this understanding as a weapon, whereas Thea would use it as a bridge. The moment of separation, when Tessa's maneuvers result in Dick and Ty being stranded on opposite sides of the planet while the threat on both ends escalates simultaneously, is the turning point from the second to the third act. It is the emotional cliffhanger the film uses as a springboard into its most intense sequences. And it works precisely because the previous 45 minutes built the relationship between Dick and Thea with enough care that their separation actually hurts. And then the adult Kalisk appears, not gradually, all at once. A creature whose size, speed, and brutality the film had built up through indirect references during the entire second act now materializes on screen with the weight of all that anticipation behind it. The first sequence encountering the adult Kalisk is shot with the camera deliberately low and closer, choice that amplifies the creature's scale by showing how much the frame has to move just to track a single gesture from it. And what the adult Kalisk is doing when it first appears in the open isn't attacking Dick, it's calling. A sound the film presents as something between a roar and a signal, and that Bud, in the very next scene, answers. You see Dick process this in real time. The creature he was about to face as an existential threat isn't hunting, it's looking for its child. This twist completely rewrites the stakes of the third act, because suddenly there isn't just one antagonist. There is a mother who will destroy anything and anyone standing between her and Bud, with no distinction between intention or guilt. And there is Tessa, who understands exactly what the adult Kalisk represents as a corporate asset and is perfectly willing to use Bud as bait to capture it. And caught in the middle of it all, are Dick and Thea separated, each facing half of a problem that can only be solved together. Dan Trachtenberg has a quote he repeated in various ways in almost every interview he gave during the promotional campaign for Creditor. Badlands. It's simple enough to sound obvious, but deep enough, too. Explain almost all of the film's visual choices. The camera must always serve the story, never the other way around. It sounds obvious. Almost every director says some version of it. The difference is what happens when you actually hold the camera and have the budget and technology to do anything visually, and you choose not to. You choose restraint. You choose simplicity when spectacle would be easier. That discipline, which is much harder than it looks, is what separates a director who makes good movies from a director who makes movies that last. Badlands was shot by Jeff Cutter with a lighting philosophy that prioritized the natural over the artificial wherever possible. New Zealand, as a location, wasn't just a pretty backdrop, was an active partner in the visual narrative. The light at certain times of day in that country has a quality that cinematographers describe as magic, not out of poetic exaggeration, but technical precision. It is a light that has density and direction simultaneously, casting shadows with volume and illuminating surfaces with a saturation that no artificial lighting grid can convincingly replicate. Cutter and Arn. Trachtenberg worked with the natural light of Rotoro and its surroundings, using a shooting strategy that required considerable logistical precision. Many of the most important sequences were scheduled for highly specific times of day-wit. On a blockbuster set where every hour costs money and every delay cascades, is an expensive and brave decision. But the results justify the cost. There are scenes on Jenna where the light has a quality you simply cannot fabricate, giving the planet a physical presence no studio stage could match. Trachtenberg's camera philosophy for this film was built in deliberate contrast to earlier entries in the franchise. The classic Predators were frequently shot with a grandiosity that made them iconic but distant. In Badlands, the camera stays close to Dick. Not necessarily close in the sense of constant close opposite, but close in perspective, in spatial positioning. You experience Jenna from the same height as Dick. You see the dangers from the same angle he does. That choice of perspective creates a visceral identification with the character, placing the audience on the exact same physical plane during intense action moments. Cutter used an approach that blends handheld camera work with more static shots, ensuring the viewer maintains spatial orientation even in the most chaotic sequences. A common criticism of contemporary action films is overly fragmented editing that makes it impossible to track physical continuity where bodies are, where hits come from, what the geography of the fight is. Badlands consciously avoids this trap. Fights are edited with enough cuts for energy, but with shots held long enough for clarity. You always know where Dick is, where the enemy is, and what each physical action means in terms of narrative consequence. That is harder than it looks. It demands camera choreography as rigorous as the stunt performer's choreography, and the Badlands action team coordinating with the specific challenge of working with an actor inside. A heavy suit on uneven terrain executed this balance with a consistency that holds from the beginning to the end of the film WTFX, whose credits include Avatar, The Way of Water, Planet of the Apes, and dozens of other benchmark VFX productions handled the digital creation of Jenna, the adult-esque aspects of Bud's visuals, and the entire layer of environmental alteration that turned real New Zealand into a convincing fictional planet. What is remarkable about WT's work in Badlands is not the scale. They've done more technically complex things in other films, But the integration, the seam between practical and digital elements is, for the most part, invisible. And invisibility, in this context, is the highest possible praise. The adult Kalesk is the most complex VFX work in the film, and the final result is a creature that functions both as a visual spectacle and a character with readable motivation. The Kalesk's design was developed over months using an evolutionary logic the WT team described as reverse biology. They first defined what the creature needed to do narratively and physically, and then built an anatomy to plausibly justify those capabilities within sci-fi parameters. The result is a being that feels like it belongs to the same ecosystem as the rest of Jenna, not a monster imported from another movie and dropped onto a different planet. The sound design in Badlands deserves its own chapter. Randy Tom, a veteran of sci-fi sound design with credits on films like Contact and Ratatouille, mixed Badlands with an approach that treated sound as a parallel narrative to the image. Jenna has its own sonic identity, a constant bed of organic sounds that are never entirely identifiable, which the ear processes as nature, but which contain subtle dissonances signaling alien artificiality. It is the audio signature of a place. That sounds natural, but isn't the nature we know. The Yotia language, as mentioned, was built from the ground up by a linguist. The process took months, starting with identifying the phonological traits that would be physically possible for Yotia facial anatomy mandibles, throat structure, lung capacity, and building a linguistic system with functional grammar from there, not just random alien noises. Demetrius Shostakolomatongi learned the language with the depth of an actor learning a dialect for a role, not someone memorizing sounds without understanding. That difference shows on screen, you believe. Dick is genuinely thinking in that language, not mentally translating from English. The musical score for Badlands was composed by Bear McCreary, who has an extensive history in sci-fi for both film and television. His work on Battlestar Galactica, The Walking Dead, and God of War established a musical language that blends traditional orchestra with electronic instrumentation in a way that feels both epic and intimate. For Badlands, McCreary developed distinct musical themes for each main character. Dick's theme is built on percussion rhythms that evolve throughout the film, starting fragmented and uncertain in the first act, and moving toward a firmer, more defined pulse as the character finds his identity. Tia's theme uses string instrumentation with light, electronic processing that hints at her synthetic nature without making her cold. There is warmth in the strings, genuine warmth, musically, reinforcing what Fanning builds in her performance. And the Kalesk has a sonic presence that functions less as a melodic theme and more as a physical event. Low frequencies you feel in your body before you process them auditorily. The kind of compositional choice that colludes with sound design to create physical impact. What unites all these technical choices? Cinematography, effects, sound, music is the coherence of a singular vision orchestrating them. This sounds simple, but is extremely rare in big-budget productions, where the sheer number of people involved and the pressure from multiple stakeholders often results in a product that feels made by committee rather than an artist. Badlands carries the coherence of an auteur film wrapped in a blockbuster package. And that coherence doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a director has enough clarity of vision and enough credibility with the studio to defend that vision at every decision point across a long, complex production. Trachtenberg had that credibility, built on Prey, and he used it surgically, not wasting political capital on minor skirmishes so he could win the battles that mattered. The PG-13 rating, the lack of human characters, the unsubtitled alien language in longer sequences, the first act pacing that prioritizes world building over immediate action. Any one of those choices could have been overturned by a nervous studio. None were, and the result is a film that feels, from the first frame to the last, entirely itself. There is a line of dialogue in Predator, Badlands, that summarizes, with almost cruel conciseness, the central philosophical argument between Dick and Tessa. It is spoken by Tessa when she finally discards Thaya as an obstacle, after concluding that her sister Synthat's empathy makes her an unpredictable corporate asset. Compassion is a design flaw. That sentence could be the Weyland-Yutani mission statement printed on an office wall. It is the logic behind every decision the corporation has made across decades of shared mythology between the Alien and Predator franchises. And it is what makes Tessa not just a functional antagonist, but a thematic one, someone whose worldview exists in direct opposition to Dick's growth arc, who throughout the entire story is learning the exact opposite. That connection is not a weakness, it is a strength. The third act begins with a sequence that is, in terms of emotional tension, the film's most intense up to that point. Dick is captured. Dyer is captured. Bud is loose, but disoriented. And Tessa methodically begins using Dick as an object of study, a series of scenes the film shoots with the clinical coldness of a medical procedure, deliberately more disturbing than any action sequence could be. It is during this capture that Weyland-Yutani reveals what it wants with the Kalisk regenerative capacity. The creature, as confirmed when Dick faces it in the open fields of Jenna, can regenerate tissue at a speed unparalleled by any being catalogued by the corporation. You sever a limb, it grows back. You inflict damage that would kill any other being. It keeps going. To Weyland-Yutani, this isn't extraordinary biology. It is a patent waiting to be filed, a fortune waiting to be monetized. And Tessa's job on Jenna was ensuring the asset arrived intact at the right laboratory. What Tessa miscalculated, and what the script presents as the fatal flaw in her logic, is that she underestimated Thaya, not as a physical threat. Thaya is no physical threat, but as an agent of emotional chaos in a situation Tessa had mapped out entirely in rational terms. Thaya loves Dick, not in a declarative way, not in words. The film never reduces their relationship to a confession scene, but she loves him in the sense that Dick's survival is, to Thaya, more important than her own preservation. And that willingness to sacrifice oneself is precisely the thing Tessa defined as a weakness, and which proves, in practice, to be the trigger for the entire breakout sequence. Thaya helps Dick escape, at the cost of herself. Tessa, discovering the betrayal, orders Tia's deactivation. And what the film does with this moment is let its weight drop without cushioning it. Thaya goes offline, not dramatically, simply, and the camera lingers on Dick afterward, in a silence that lasts exactly as long as needed for the viewer to feel what that means before moving on. But Dick moves on, and what happens next is one of the best constructed action sequences the franchise has ever produced, and one that works precisely because it was earned by everything that came before. Stripped of his Yortia weaponry, Dick does something the film subtly set up throughout the entire second act. He uses Jenna. The planet presented as an existential threat becomes his arsenal. the hostile vegetation, the specific textures of the minor forest creatures. The natural chemical elements of Jenna's soil dick turns them into organic weapons with an efficiency that is impressive, exactly because you've never seen a predator need to improvise before. The scene where he crafts his weapons using the planet's resources is cut with the rhythm of a montage that carries the energy of a preparation sequence, that specific kind of anticipation building score that makes your heart race before the fight even begins. And then he and Bud assault the Weyland-Yutani base. The assault on the base is choreographed as a mix of infiltration and direct destruction that intelligently utilizes the specific capabilities of each character. Dick is brute force and speed. Bud is the element of surprise because the Weyland-Yutani androids are calibrated to identify Yotia threats, but they have no recognition system for a creature entirely absent from their database. This blind spot in the enemy catalog is exploited with delicious dark humor in a sequence where Bud breaches the base's outer security with an ease that is simultaneously comical and devastating. The release of the adult Karlisk is the moment the sequence's scale shifts entirely. When the creature is freed from Weyland-Yutani's ice containment and orients itself when the instinct to find its child merges with the rage of capture. What happens to the base is less a battle and more a natural disaster. The Kalesk doesn't fight the androids. It goes through them. Cutter's camera shoots this from below, using the androids in the foreground for scale every humanoid figure obliterated in milliseconds, reinforcing what this creature represents as a force of nature. But Tessa survives. Because Tessa also prepared. The power loader scene is a moment that fans of the Alien franchise will recognize instantly. The iconic image of Ripley in the mechanical exoskeleton from 1986's Aliens is one of the most recognizable images in all of sci-fi. Trachtenberg deploys this reference in a way that works on two levels, as a genuine homage for those who know the shared mythology, and as pure action spectacle for those coming to the film with no context. You don't need to have seen Aliens to understand the visual impact of Tessa stepping onto the field in a mech suit with Dick's plasma caster mounted on the right arm. The fight between the Kalesk and Tessa in the power loader is shot with a grandiosity. The rest of the third act had been building toward a release of tension the film had dammed up with deliberate discipline. It is huge. It is loud. It is destructive on a scale that uses every inch of the Weyland-Yutani base as an arena. And it carries emotional weight beyond the visual spectacle, because one of the two beings in this fight is a mother trying to survive long enough to get back to her child. Tessa kills the Kalesk, not with brute force, but with the same cold logic that defined her from the start, calculating that the only way to destroy a creature with regenerative capabilities was from the inside out. The detonation of the ice grenade inside the Kalesk is an end that is simultaneously functionally efficient. It is exactly the kind of solution Tessa would find, and emotionally devastating given what the creature represented to the story. But Tessa survives the collapse of the damaged Kalesk and turns to the only target that still matters, Thaya. The final scene between Tessa and Thaya is a duel of mirrors. The same voice, the same face, two versions of the exact same hardware unit, one believing empathy is a flaw, the other having proven that empathy is the only reason any of them are still alive. Tessa aims a weapon. She gives her speech about the Weyland-Yutani mission, about good corporate intentions, about Tia's structural weakness, and Dick, who has arrived silently behind her, cuts the speech short with a plasma blade through Tessa's spine before she finishes her sentence. Tessa's decapitation happens off camera. The film doesn't need to show the act for its impact to be felt. What matters is the result. Dick holding Tessa's metallic head as a trophy. The only kind of proof Yortia culture recognizes. The only currency his father still understands. And with that trophy in his hands, Dick looks at Tia, who's been reactivated. Who is intact, who looks back at him with that specific warmth only she has. Bud is beside them both. The planet around them smolders softly with the remains of the Weyland-Yutani base. And the three, without any word of formal resolution, turn outward from Jenna. What comes next is not a triumphant return. It is a reckoning there. It's a truth about redemption stories that the best films understand and the worst ignore. Genuine redemption isn't returning to the starting point as an improved being. It's arriving at a completely different point, with completely different values, and realizing that the place you came from is no longer the place you belong. Predator. Badlands understands this entirely. When Dick leaves Jenna, the mission he carries, with him Tessa's severed head as a trophy is, on the surface, the exact kind of proof Yortia culture acknowledges. It is currency in the clan's vocabulary. And for a moment, the script lets you believe that perhaps Dick's arc is precisely that. The rejected young warrior proving his worth on his father's terms and returning to his rightful place in the hierarchy. It's the most obvious arc available for the story, and the film lets you settle into that expectation long enough that what actually happens hits with far greater impact. Dick's arrival on Yortia Prime is shot with a contained grandiosity. You see the Yortia home planet, its sky, its imposing, organic architecture, and you feel the weight of what Dick is returning to face. It's not a victory lap. It is an accounting. And Dick knows this from the moment the ship touches down. The reunion with Injar takes place in a formal clan ceremony and, again, much like the film's opening scene, the camera uses Injar's position of power with surgical precision. He is elevated. Dick is at ground level. The distance between them isn't just physical. It is historical, emotional, generational. The entire distance between a father who built his identity around a code and a son who discovered that code was insufficient. Dick presents Tessa's head. Yangar examines it and rejects it. The rejection doesn't stem from cruelty for cruelty's sake. It holds logic within Yortia cultured, had promised the head of a Kalisk, and what he brought was something lesser by the clan hierarchy's standard. The promise wasn't fulfilled by the metric the father uses to measure fulfillment. And so Injar pronounces what he believes is the final verdict. Dick is still not enough. But then something happens that no previous moment in the film had explicitly prepared you for. Dick doesn't bow his head. He doesn't ask for forgiveness. He offers no excuses, context, or explanation. He challenges Injar to a duel. The duel begins with Injar sending clan guards against Dick rather than facing him directly. Choice that says more about Injar than words ever could. And the way Dick defeats these warriors, one by one, using precisely the skills Jenna forced him to develop: improvisation, environmental awareness, speed over brute force, is a practical demonstration of what exile did to him. Jenna turned Dick into a warrior that the clan's formal training could never have produced. With the guards defeated and Enja restrained by Dick's plasma whip, The father does something the film refused to let the audience expect. He admires him. The line Jar delivers with the specific hesitation of someone who has spent his entire life measuring things and is now measuring something that exceeds all previous metrics, is one of the most powerful in the film exactly because it is so unadorned. Perhaps the right son survived. There is a revelation embedded in that line that the script had planted in the film's prologue, which many in the first-time audience only processed retrospectively. Dick is not an only child. He had a brother Quay, and the film's violent prologue, which many viewers interpreted merely as cultural context setting, showed Nejar killing Quay, not out of dishonor, but because Quay had saved Dick's life at a moment when clan culture dictated Quay should let his weaker brother die. Saving the life of someone the code declares should have died is, in Jar's Yochia logic, a weakness that contaminates the clan. And Injar had eliminated that weakness with the cold efficiency of someone who believes absolutely in the code. He follows. The phrase "perhaps the right son survived" therefore carries a weight far beyond the immediate present. It is Injar saying he believed for decades that he had eliminated the weak son and preserved the strong, and is now looking at the son who survived, who should have died by the code, and seeing that this son is the stronger of the two. It's the kind of contradiction that shatters a belief system in real time. And Jar then tells Dick to yield, to take his rightful place in the clan, that the strength he has shown deserves the recognition that was always due, and Dick replies that he no longer needs the clan, because he already has his own. What happens next is fast, definitive, and emotionally complex in a way the film refuses to simplify. Bud, who has grown considerably since Jenna, who is much larger and vastly more capable than when the three left the planet, bites Jar's head off. The clan patriarch, the man who defined Dick's entire reality for his whole life, is eliminated by a creature Dick chose to protect when the code told him to protect nothing. The poetry of that circularity doesn't need to be spelled out. You feel it, but the film is careful here. It does not treat Najar's death as a simple triumph. There is no victory music. There is no celebration from Dick. There is a silence that acknowledges the complexity of what just happened, the death of a father, the end of a reference point that, however cruel, still structured Dick's world. This emotional restraint is one of the script's most mature choices, the kind of respect for the audience that distinguishes narratives that trust their viewers from those that insist on telling them what to feel. With Enja dead, Dick turns to Thaya and Bud. The three stand together on the surface of Yatia Prime, under the sky of the homeworld that had tried to define Dick by what he wasn't. And what the future holds for the three of them is, for the first time in the character's history, entirely in their hands. The pre-credits scene is one of the most elegantly ambiguous endings in recent blockbuster cinema. Dick, Thaya, and Bud stand in an open field on Yatia Prime, and there is a moment of quiet between the three that the film allows to exist. Uninterrupted, a rare moment in this type of production, serving no setup or anticipation function, existing purely as an emotional breather, as permission for the audience to feel what the characters are feeling. Then, on the dusty horizon of Yatia Prime, a ship descends. Thaya asks, with that specific curiosity that defines her, if they are friends. Of Deck answers with two words that closed the film and simultaneously open every possible question about the franchise's future. My mother. Cut to black. It is an ending that Dan Trachtenberg described in an Entertainment Weekly interview as deliberately ambiguous. It could be interpreted as the setup for a threat even greater than Jar. A reading where Dick's mother is an even more formidable figure than the father. Or it could be interpreted as dark humor. The final joke of a film that used humor with surgical precision throughout its narrative. Or, perhaps, as the most genuine promise, that the person Dick didn't mention once during the film, who exists implicitly as the counterpoint to his empathy-void father, might be the next piece of the universe Trachtenberg is building. What is certain is that this ending captures in miniature what makes the entire film work. The refusal to resolve everything neatly. The confidence that good stories don't end, they transform. Dick didn't come home. He arrived at a new place. And what that new place represents for him, for Thea, for Bud, and for the Predator franchise is a question left open with the specific elegance of someone who knows the next story. Hasn't been told yet. Trachtenberg has already confirmed that there is a third idea in his head. That after Prey, Badlands, and Killer of Killers, there is something else that drives him in the exact same way the other ideas did, with the feeling that no one has done it yet. What is it? We don't know yet. But the story of Predator, Badlands, at least, is complete. And it is complete in the most satisfying way possible. No plot holes, no betrayals. And featuring a character you will remember long after the credits roll. Sometimes. To understand why a movie works so well, it's not enough to look at what's on screen. You have to look at everything that happened before and around it, the creative decisions, the plan changes, the risks taken, the things that almost went wrong, and the small details no one notices but that make all the difference in the final result. Predator, Badlands is exactly that kind of movie. The final product feels fluid, confident, almost inevitable. But nothing about it was inevitable. It was all built choice by choice. One detail few viewers catch right away is the production title. During filming in New Zealand, the project wasn't called Predator, Badlands. It was called Backpack. This type of fake title is common on large-scale productions. It serves to misdirect onlookers, keep paparazzi away from locations, and maintain a modicum of creative privacy while the film is still under construction. But the specific choice of the name Backpack wasn't random. There was something metaphorical there. Dick carries on his back, literally and figuratively, a weight that isn't just the gear he takes to Jenna. It's the expectation of an entire clan. It's the weight of a name, their father's name, the species name, the franchise's name. Filming began in August 2024 and lasted 57 days, heavily concentrated in remote, controlled access areas of New Zealand. The logistics were complex, transporting cast and crew to isolated spots, hauling heavy camera gear, utilizing minimal lighting setups, since the philosophy was to use natural light as much as possible, and still maintaining the tight schedule of a studio like 20th Century Studios is a production feat. Even more so when the protagonist spends most of his time inside a suit that requires frequent breaks for physical health reasons. Demetrius Schuster-Kolomatongi spoke in interviews about the challenge of acting under 15 kilos of costume every day. He described the sensation of being in the suit as a combination of a portable sauna and medieval armor, intense heat, limited mobility, partial vision, and yet he had to not only move with agility but also convey emotional nuance. The costume and special effects team adjusted the suit multiple times during production to find the balance between aesthetic fidelity to classic Predator design and the practical functionality needed for Demetrius to execute demanding scenes without undue risk. Elle Fanning, on the other hand, faced a very different challenge. To play Thaya, she had to learn how not to use her legs. This sounds simple in theory, just frame from the waist up and call it a day. But the reality is that the entire body participates in acting. Balance, center of gravity, gestures, even. The way you breathe changes when the body believes it has no support from the legs. Fanning spent weeks working on posture, torso and arm movement, and synchronization with the bass apparatus used in scenes where Thaya moves. The idea was that the character should never look carried by the effects, but integrated into that technology. And it works. Moves so naturally on that bass that you forget it is the result of a careful combination of acting, design, and digital post-production. Another fascinating, behind-the-scenes aspect was the creation of the Yortia language used in the film. Instead of repeating random sounds or generic noises like older sci-fi films, the team brought in a linguist to develop a functional language with coherent phonetics, grammar, and vocabulary. Demetrius and other Yatia actors learned lines with specific pronunciation, internal rhythm, and clear intention. This has two important effects. First, it gives the actors something concrete to work with. They aren't just grunting. They are speaking sentences with internal meaning. Second, it creates a texture of authenticity that the viewer feels even without understanding the words. You sense that the language has rules. It isn't just alien improvisation. WTFX's involvement was decisive for the final visual quality. The New Zealand-based company had already built a practically unparalleled reputation for integrating digital effects with practical elements. On Badlands, the philosophy was always, use digital to expand the real, not to replace it when the real is possible. The Weyland-Yutani structures, for example, had partial-scale physical bases built on set, and WT filled in whatever was necessary for extensions, detail levels, or destruction. The Kalesk and Bud followed the same hybrid logimaquettes and animatronics for specific moments. CGI for movements or situations demanding full flexibility. A curious behind-the-scenes fact is that the Kalesk went through several design stages before reaching its final version. Initially, the concept was for a more humanoid creature, something closer to an extremely evolved or corrupted Yotia. But as the script emphasized the Kalesk's role as the predator of predators, artists realized it needed to clearly be something else, an apex of a different ecological niche, not just a variation of the protagonist's species. The final result, with that mix of brutal muscle mass, unique bone structure, and textures echoing Jenner's flora, reflects that conceptual evolution. On the human behind-the-scenes side, the mood on set was described in reports as surprisingly light for a film with such intense themes. Elle Fanning and Demetrius Shostakola-Matongi developed a backstage dynamic that somewhat mirrored the Tia-Dick relationship. Her more expansive and playful, him more reserved, observing before joining in on the joke. Many of the lighter moments between Thaya and Dick on screen were born from rehearsed improvisations stemming from that real chemistry, glances, micro-reactions, small pauses in speech or movement that weren't rigidly marked in the script. But that Trachtenberg allowed and encouraged precisely because they breathed life into the relationship. On the reception side, the numbers tell a clear story. The film opened with $40 million its opening weekend in the US, the highest opening weekend ever for the franchise. Worldwide, it reached approximately $184 million, a more than solid result for a PG-13 film featuring a masked protagonist and no humans. In a franchise coming off mixed results, critical approval hovered around 85% on aggregators, while audiences pushed that number even higher, sitting around 96% on audience-focused indexes. Beyond the numbers, there was specific recognition. Elle Fanning received the Saturn Award for Best Actress for her work in Badlands, an award focused on sci-fi, fantasy, and horror that frequently recognizes performances the Academy ignores. The film also appeared on year-end best-of lists from genre publications, which particularly highlighted the boldness of placing the Predator in the role of a sympathetic protagonist. Another major point in behind-the-scenes discussions was the PG-13 rating. Older fans of the franchise, accustomed to the graphic violence of the original film and some subsequent sequels, reacted with skepticism upon learning Badlands would take a less explicit approach. But Trachtenberg defended the choice as a creative opportunity. Instead of relying on gore to build impact, the film works with tension, suggestion, and implicit brutality. That doesn't mean the violence disappeared. It means it is shown differently. And the film's success with audiences seems to indicate that gamble paid off. In constructing the film's visual identity, there is also an element of silent conversation with the rest of the Alien Predator universe. Easter eggs. Badlands is full of small details connecting the story to other parts of the mythology. Weyland-Yutani insignias in specific places, serial numbers recalling ships or operations seen in previous films, corridor and structured layouts echoing the Alien films, subtle visual references to Prey and Yortia design elements. None of these details are essential to understanding the main story, and that is the correct choice, because the narrative needs to work on its own for newcomers, but for those who know the expanded universe, these small clues create a pleasurable sense of continuity. Behind all of this lies a grander strategy, turning the Predator franchise into a universe with multiple tones and formats. Prey showed the formula worked in a historical period with an indigenous protagonist. Badlands showed it worked with an alien protagonist, no humans, on a completely new planet. The animated series, Killer of Killers, running in parallel, expands the universe from another angle. The message is clear. There is no single way to tell stories within this world. As long as there are strong ideas, the franchise can keep reinventing itself. And perhaps this is the most important behind-the-scenes fact of all. Predator: Badlands is not just a good standalone film. It is concrete proof that the franchise can take risks without losing its audience, that it can switch viewpoints, tones, protagonist types, and still maintain thematic cohesion, that it can treat a classic monster as a tragic protagonist without losing the sense of danger and intensity that has always defined these films. When you put all these pieces together, the discrete working title, the grueling New Zealand locations, the 15-kilo suit, the constructed language, WT's hybrid effects, the on-set chemistry, the risky choices regarding the rating and character structure, the care with Easter eggs, you clearly see that nothing in Predator: Badlands was by accident, and that is why the final result feels so organic. What looks natural on screen is almost always the result of an intense level of work that the audience rarely sees. And that work, in this case, was worth every minute. Predator. Badlands arrived in theaters on November 6, 2025, carrying a package of expectations that could have sunk a less well-executed film. A franchise coming off highs and lows. A director betting big after an unlikely success. A protagonist that defied all established genre conventions. A PG-13 rating in a territory that had always been R. And yet, when the lights came up after the final screening, the film didn't just meet expectations, it redefined them. The numbers speak for themselves. The $40 million domestic opening was a historic milestone for the franchisor, passing the first 1987 Predator in nominal terms and setting a new standard for what audiences were willing to pay for a fresh vision of the series. Worldwide, the $184 million total gross represents a solid return on an estimated budget of around $80 million. Especially considering the film didn't rely on traditional movie stars or cheap nostalgia. It was a success built on the strength of its story and execution. Critical reception was equally impressive. Rotten Tomatoes registered an 85% approval rating among professional critics, a respectable number for any blockbuster, but particularly notable for a franchise that had repeatedly disappointed in prior years. Metacritic followed with a score of 72, reflecting a consensus that the film delivered solid action, competent direction, and a narrative that respected the audience's intelligence. But it was the audience numbers that truly told the whole story. 96% on the Rotten Tomatoes, popcorn meter, and an A cinema score, the best in franchise history. IMDb, where the audience vote carries particular weight among genre. Fans closed at a 7.2 out of 10, an excellent number for a film that caught so many fans off guard with its bold choices. What is clear from the aggregated numbers is that Predator, Badlands found a rare balance between satisfying the expectations of hardcore franchise fans and winning over new viewers who arrived with no prior attachment. The controversy surrounding the PG-13 rating was, predictably, the biggest point of debate. Older fans of the franchise, accustomed to the graphic violence and visceral terror of the 1987 original, questioned whether a Predator film could work without showing abundant blood and gore. The film's answer was a masterclass in suggestion over explicit displayed attention, created by the Kalisk's implicit threat works better than any gore could, and the brutality of the fights is felt in the physical impact of the blows, not in the amount of red liquid on screen. The audience, largely, validated this choice. The more accessible rating broadened the film's reach without compromising its high-caliber identity as high-caliber sci-fi action. The film's cultural impact extends beyond traditional box office and review numbers. Demetrius Schuster-Kolomacchi's performance as Dick sparked significant conversations about recognition for physical actors in costumed roles, conversations echoing the ones Andy Serkis faced for decades with Gollum and Caesar. Although the Academy Awards remain notoriously resistant to this kind of work, Elle Fanning's Saturn Award and the film's technical nominations in visual effects and sound categories signal that the industry is slowly recognizing what the audience already understands what makes Predator. Badlands, particularly important in the franchise's history, is not just its immediate success, but the path it paves. Before Don Trachtenberg took the creative helm with Prey, The Predator franchise was a classic case of a dormant property, sporadic films that divided audiences. Poorly received crossovers, reboot attempts that couldn't gain traction. Prey proved the franchise could work outside the original formula. Badlands proved something even more radical, that it could completely invert the series. Central perspective and still maintained thematic cohesion and commercial appeal. The film establishes Dick, Dyer, and Bud not just as survivors of an isolated adventure, but as founders of a new Yotia clan, the first clan in franchise history not defined by the rigid tradition of Dick's father, but by the shared experience of three different species united by mutual need and conscious choice. This narrative foundation has massive implications for the future of the franchise. Dick's final comment about my mother, which cuts to the credits before any resolution, works as a deliberate tease, leaving the audience wanting more without forcing an immediate sequel. Compared to the existing franchise canon, Badlands stands out for its refusal to repeat worn-out formulas. The original Predator remains untouchable as an 80s action classic. Predator 2 expanded the urban mythology in interesting ways but never recaptured the initial impact. The Alien vs. Predator crossovers delivered spectacle but little character. The 2018 reboot was a step in the right direction but stumbled in execution. Prey was the first true rebirth. Badlands is the confirmation that this rebirth has the legs to run for a long time. Who should watch it? Anyone who appreciates well-executed sci-fi action with characters that matter. Franchise fans will love the expansion of the Yotia universe and the subtle connections to the broader mythology. Casual viewers will enjoy the clear emotional narrative and the well-choreographed action sequences. Families looking for something beyond the standard superhero fare will find a sci-fi alternative here that works on multiple levels. It is not a perfect film. Some will miss the more explicit violence of the original movies. Others might find the first act deliberately slow for a blockbuster. But these are conscious choices, not execution flaws. And when you combine narrative courage plus solid direction plus genuine performances, benchmark visual effects plus an ending that respects the audience's intelligence, the result is one of the best blockbusters of 2025. Predator, Badlands deserves to be on your list. If you like sci-fi that respects its conventions but has the courage to break them when necessary, this is essential. If you want to see an iconic monster become a hero without losing an ounce of its ferocity, you won't find a better example. And if you simply want 2 hours of high-quality entertainment that leaves you thinking about family, belonging, and what it means to be strong long after the credits roll, this film delivers. It is worth every minute of your time. And when the inevitable sequel arrives, because numbers like these guarantee it will arrive, you will be ready. Because Predator Badlands didn't just revive a franchise. It showed that it still has a lot to say, and it said it in the most convincing way possible, with a story that puts the monster center stage, yet leaves you rooting for him from the first second to the last.